A WNBA team co-owner just got suspended for screaming at two teenage girls, and the player at the center of it all still refuses to back down. Somewhere in this story, there is a courtside confrontation that left a 16-year-old in tears. A rival coach who put on a t-shirt just to send a message. A superstar who got so tired of the question that she cut a reporter off in 4 words, and a moment near the very end where the White House itself got pulled into a WNBA argument. Almost nobody saw that last part coming, so stay with me because it changes how you look at everything that happened before it. Before we get into it, if you are new here, hit subscribe. This channel breaks down the biggest storylines in women's basketball as they happen, and this one is nowhere close to finished. It started with a magazine profile. On July 21st, ESPN published a lengthy feature on Indiana Fever guard Sophie Cunningham, one of the most popular and most polarizing players in the league. The piece covered her upbringing in Missouri, her personality, her rise as a fan favorite. Buried inside it was a section on a topic she almost never got asked about directly in public. The reporter asked her about transgender athletes competing in women's sports, and Cunningham did not dodge it. She said she wanted to protect young girls in locker rooms and young girls in sport from having to compete against biological men. She said she had been getting accused of hating transgender people, and she pushed back hard on that framing, insisting she was there to extend love. But that real love came with honesty attached. That was it. One section, in one feature, about one athlete's personal opinion, and it detonated. Within hours, the clip was everywhere. Supporters called it common sense. Critics called it a talking point, dressed up in soft language. Opinion pieces went up within days, accusing her of using the language of protection to disguise a hard exclusionary stance. One widely shared column argued that calling trans women biological men mischaracterizes who they are, and that dressing the position up as concern for children does not change what the underlying claim is actually doing. Cunningham, who has been publicly associated with conservative politics for a while now, picked up a new nickname online that stuck fast, and it was not meant as a compliment. Most athletes, when they get hit with backlash like that, soften the message the next time a camera is in their face. Cunningham did the opposite. The very next day, she told reporters she said what she said, that she thought it was common sense, and that she would keep believing it. No walk back, no press release, just a direct restatement on camera, in front of everyone. And that is exactly when this stopped being a one-day story and turned into something the entire league had to deal with for weeks. Here is something a lot of people arguing about this online do not seem to realize. There has never been an openly transgender woman on a WNBA roster. Not one. This entire debate exploded around a hypothetical, not an active situation happening on any court. But the timing made it combustible anyway, because the league had just finalized a new collective bargaining agreement stating that only players who are women are eligible to compete, and that detail poured gasoline on a fire that was already lit. There is also a wider backdrop here that a lot of the online arguing skips right past. The NCAA has its own policy barring transgender women from women's competitions. So does the International Olympic Committee. So does the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee. More than 24 states already have laws restricting transgender participation in girls' and women's school sports. Cunningham did not invent this fight. She stepped into one that had already been raging across nearly every level of organized sport for years, and it landed on her locker room at the worst possible time for a team fighting for playoff position. It also did not take long for organized groups to attach themselves to the story on both sides. A nonpartisan group calling itself Women Are Real started sponsoring pre-game gatherings outside Fever road games, and a women's apparel brand built around the XX-XY chromosome symbol became the unofficial uniform of Cunningham's supporters in the stands. On the other side, fans coordinated their own shirts and signs defending transgender inclusion, turning nearly every road arena into a split crowd before the ball was even tipped. What started as one athlete answering one question in one magazine profile had, within about 2 weeks, turned into an actual organized movement following her from city to city. The fever hit the road right after the story broke, and that is when this stopped being just online noise and started showing up inside actual arenas. First stop, Seattle. The Fever were in town to play the Storm, and outside Climate Pledge Arena, a small rally had gathered in support of Cunningham, loosely tied to a pair of statewide ballot initiatives about transgender participation in school sports. Inside the building, two 16-year-old girls sat courtside wearing shirts referencing male and female chromosomes, holding a handmade sign that read, simply, "Thank you, Sophie, for speaking up for girls." Keep that image in your head, because what happened next is the moment that actually took this story national. A woman approached the girls during the game, not a random fan. Celeste Keaton, a minority co-owner of the Seattle Storm. According to the girls and an independent journalist who was sitting with them, Keaton opened by telling them Jesus loves everyone, then said she hoped they would be forgiven for what she called their sin. Then, according to their account, the tone flipped completely. She allegedly called their behavior insane, dropped an expletive while doing it, and told them to stop what they were doing. One of the girls said she had never been spoken to like that in her life, and she was in tears by the time it was over. Nobody nearby stepped in to defend them. Once the story got out, the WNBA moved fast. Keaton was suspended from attending the Storm's next 5 home games and hit with an undisclosed fine. The team's majority owner, Ginny Gilder, put out a statement acknowledging what happened and apologizing on behalf of the organization. Cunningham, who had not spoken to media right after that game, broke her silence the next day on social media. She wrote that she believed there was a safe space for everybody: biological women, biological men, trans women, and trans men, and that people could disagree and still be kind to each other. She praised the two girls for standing up for what they believed and called the co-owner's behavior truly embarrassing, adding that it showed what kind of leader Keaton was. That single post did more to define public opinion on Cunningham than almost anything she had said in the original ESPN piece. This was not actually the first time Cunningham had waded into this exact subject either, which is worth knowing if you want the full picture. Back in March of 2022, while she was still building her name in the league, she retweeted a post criticizing a transgender college swimmer's national championship win. The backlash then was smaller, but real, and Cunningham responded at the time with a written note saying she stood with all people of every race, religion, and background, and hoped everyone could compete fairly. In other words, this was not a position she stumbled into during one bad interview. It was something she had been quietly sitting with for years before ESPN ever asked her about it directly. Now here is where it gets interesting, because Cunningham did not just get support from anonymous accounts online. Former college swimmer and prominent women's sports activist Riley Gaines showed up at a later Fever game in Minneapolis and posed for a photo with Cunningham, holding a sign that thanked her by name. Gaines has been one of the most visible voices in this exact debate since 2022, when she tied for a national championship placement with transgender swimmer Leah Thomas, and later became an outspoken advocate against transgender participation in women's sports. That photo of her with Cunningham spread almost as fast as the original ESPN clip had weeks earlier. Retired college football linebacker Brian Urlacher weighed in publicly too, throwing his support behind Cunningham's stance and describing her willingness to say it out loud as something he respected. Former ESPN anchor Sage Steele went on national television and defended Cunningham directly, pointing out that Cunningham had not gone looking for this fight. She had simply answered a reporter's question honestly and then refused to hide from the fallout. But do not think for a second this was one-sided, because 3 days after Seattle in Minneapolis, the other side of this story showed up in full force, and it came from someone wearing a Lynx polo. The Fever traveled to play the Minnesota Lynx, and head coach Cheryl Reeve, who has been outspoken about transgender inclusion for years, walked out for warm-ups wearing a t-shirt that read, "Trans kids belong." Fans in the crowd wore matching shirts. Outside the arena, demonstrators held signs on both sides of the issue, some reading, "Thank you, Sophie," others declaring "Protect trans women" through a loudspeaker. And then, right there at midcourt before tip-off, Reeve and Cunningham had a conversation. Nobody around them could hear exactly what was said, but cameras caught them talking, clearly disagreeing. And yet by the time it ended, it looked calm. Reeve later told reporters that both of them understood they had platforms and that both wanted, more than anything, to educate rather than attack. She said there were things they had in common and things they did not, and that having the conversation in person, instead of behind a screen, mattered to both of them. Cunningham echoed that afterward, telling reporters she respected Reeve specifically because she chose to show up and talk face-to-face instead of posting about it. Compare that to what happened in Seattle just days earlier, and you start to see two completely different ways of handling the exact same disagreement from two people who landed on opposite sides of it. While all of this was unfolding, a separate and completely unrelated storyline about Cunningham started circulating online, and it is worth clearing up because a lot of channels blur the two together. Connecticut Sun center Brittney Griner, who was once Cunningham's teammate in Phoenix, jokingly called her annoying to play against in an unrelated interview about their on-court rivalry, and the two of them were later seen laughing and recreating one of Cunningham's viral on-court celebration moments together before a game. That was two former teammates having fun, nothing more. It had nothing to do with the transgender athletes debate, but plenty of clips online spliced the two stories together to make it look like Griner was taking a side. She was not, at least not publicly, and it is worth being precise about that instead of letting the algorithm blur two separate stories into one. Stick around, because right after that game is when Caitlin Clark, who had said almost nothing publicly for nearly 2 full weeks, finally opened her mouth about her own teammates' controversy, and it did not go the way most reporters in that room expected. After the Fever lost that Minneapolis game, snapping a 5-game winning streak, a reporter asked Clark how the team had been handling the outside noise around Cunningham. Clark's answer was careful. She said it was not really a conversation they had in their own locker room and that she believed it was up to the leagues and governing bodies to work with athletes to find solutions. Her focus, she said, was on basketball and on figuring out how to start winning again. When the reporter tried to push for more, Clark cut him off. 4 words. "I just answered for you." And that was the end of it. Clark was not the only one dodging the topic that week. Earlier on the road trip, Fever head coach Stephanie White was asked directly about the rallies following her team, and before she could really answer, a team public relations staffer stepped in and read a prepared statement saying the organization and Cunningham had no knowledge of and no connection to the demonstrations outside their games. The press conference wrapped up almost immediately after that. White did later admit, in a separate interview, that there was real frustration inside the building about how much this story had taken over the conversation around a team fighting for playoff seeding. She made her own personal view clear too, saying she does not believe exclusion is ever the answer, even while trying to keep her locker room focused on basketball. So picture the position Indiana was in during all of this. One of their most popular players doubling down publicly, night after night, their franchise player avoiding the topic entirely and getting visibly frustrated every time it came up, their head coach stuck trying to hold a locker room together while cameras waited outside every single practice for a soundbite that had nothing to do with the actual games. Before we get to Portland, it is worth pointing out just how far outside the sports pages this thing traveled. This was not just a WNBA story anymore. Cable news booked segments on it. Political commentators who had never once discussed a WNBA box score suddenly had opinions about Sophie Cunningham. Sports talk radio spent entire hours on it, and columnists across completely different outlets rushed to publish takes within hours of every new development, whether it was Cunningham doubling down, the Seattle incident, or Reeve's t-shirt. One national outlet covering the league even wrote that the WNBA was in the middle of its most watched season ever, which meant every single one of these moments was landing in front of the biggest audience the league had ever had. That is part of why this refused to die down. There was simply too large an audience watching for any single side to quietly let it go. Let's go to Portland next, because the road trip did not end in Minneapolis, and Portland gave us the loudest arena reaction of the entire saga. When the Fever played the Portland expansion team, fans booed Cunningham every single time she touched the ball, loud enough that broadcast microphones picked it up clean. On the concourse at halftime, a lone woman held up a "Thank you, Sophie" sign, and a small group of fans approached her, not with hostility exactly, but to argue that Cunningham's own language about protecting girls in locker rooms was, in their view, absurd, since nobody was suggesting trans teammates posed any threat to anyone. The conversation stayed tense, but never boiled over into anything physical. Cunningham herself did not back off the court either, going on to hit shots and let her play do a lot of the talking that night. On top of all of this, Indiana was already dealing with real basketball problems that had nothing to do with any of it. Veteran forward Damiris Dantas was ruled out for the rest of the season after knee surgery, cutting into an already thin frontcourt rotation right as the playoff race tightened. So every single day, Stephanie White was fielding questions about a season-ending injury, a 5-game losing skid at one point, and a national culture war story, all at the same time, all before her team had even taken the floor. Now let's go back to Cunningham herself, because after Seattle, after Minneapolis, after Portland, after weeks of this dominating every WNBA headline, she finally sat down for an extended interview to address it directly, away from a scrum of reporters after a loss. She told broadcaster Elle Duncan that she felt like the actual basketball being played this season, some of the best basketball in league history, by a lot of measures, was getting completely overshadowed by this one storyline. She said she was not backing away from her position, but that watching the on-court product get buried under the noise made her sad. She has separately criticized WNBA media coverage in general, arguing reporters were prioritizing viral controversy over the actual games being played on the floor, at a moment when her Fever team, sitting around 19 wins and 11 losses, were locked in a genuine fight for playoff seeding. It is worth being fair here in saying plenty of people inside the sport pushed back hard on Cunningham, not just anonymous critics online. Her own former teammate, Brianna Turner, wrote a national op-ed earlier this year arguing that debates over who counts as a woman distract from the bigger structural issues actually limiting opportunities for women in sports. That is a current WNBA player, someone who has shared a locker room with Cunningham, publicly disagreeing with her on the record. That kind of internal pushback never fully went away, even as the pro-Cunningham rallies kept growing outside road arenas. And that brings us to the part almost nobody expected. At some point during this saga, the White House itself weighed in, publicly defending Cunningham's right to voice her opinion. When the country's political leadership starts commenting on a WNBA guard's take on a sports policy question, you know this stopped being just about basketball a long time ago. It is also worth touching briefly on the actual substance underneath all the noise, because most of the arguing online skipped right past it. Supporters of Cunningham's position point to research suggesting that hormone therapy does not fully erase certain physical advantages tied to biological sex, citing studies on lung function and body composition. Opponents argue that no transgender woman has ever actually competed in the WNBA, that the entire debate is being fought over a hypothetical rather than a real competitive situation, and that framing trans women as a safety threat in locker rooms is not supported by any documented case. Both of those arguments kept getting repeated across nearly every interview, every panel, and every op-ed in this saga, largely talking past each other rather than actually engaging with the other side's specific claim. One more piece of context, because you will see this connection made all over the internet, and you deserve the accurate version of it. Basketball Hall of Famer Charles Barkley made almost identical comments at one point, saying flatly that men should not play sports against women, while also stating clearly that he supports the gay and transgender community. People online started sharing his comments alongside the Cunningham story as if he was reacting to her directly. He was not. Barkley said those words on an Outkick interview more than a year before Cunningham's ESPN profile ever came out, responding to a completely unrelated question about a youth sports study. Same general opinion, different moment, different conversation. Two athletes from two different corners of sports landing in roughly the same place over a year apart, without ever actually crossing paths on the subject. So where does this leave things right now? Cunningham has not changed one word of her position, and she has said publicly she does not plan to. Caitlin Clark has drawn a hard line around discussing it at all, choosing every single time to redirect back to basketball. Cheryl Reeve modeled what a respectful, in-person disagreement can actually look like at midcourt, in front of a packed arena. Celeste Keaton is still serving her suspension after the ugliest single moment of this entire saga. Riley Gaines, Brian Urlacher, and Sage Steele have all publicly backed Cunningham, while Brianna Turner and a wave of columnists have pushed back just as hard from the other direction. And somewhere in the middle of it, two teenage girls who just wanted to hold up a sign for a player they admired ended up at the center of a national conversation they never asked to be part of. Think about how fast all of this actually moved. One magazine profile on July 21st, a doubling down the very next day. A courtside confrontation in Seattle before that week was even over. A t-shirt and a mid-court conversation in Minneapolis days after that. Booze raining down in Portland. A tearful interview from two 16-year-old girls who never expected to become part of a national story. Hall of Famers and retired athletes weighing in from completely unrelated interviews recorded over a year apart, spliced together by the internet into something that looked like one continuous conversation. And finally, the White House itself commenting on a WNBA guard's personal opinion. All of that in less than 3 weeks around one basketball team that was simply trying to make the playoffs. The Fever are still fighting for playoff position, the games keep getting played, and every single time Sophie Cunningham checks into a game on the road, the crowd noise tells you everything about which side of this debate that particular arena is on. Nobody involved seems ready to let this one go quietly. And with the postseason approaching and cameras following every remaining road trip, this story is not finished writing itself yet. Whatever happens next, in the next arena, on the next road trip, is going to keep shaping how this entire season is remembered long after the final standings are set. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.